If you're looking to be informed, then I have good news for you. Today, I have 5 common arguments that I can almost guarantee that you've never heard before and probably have never even thought of before. And I can deliver on such a hefty promise because, well, I made all of it up. Well, most of it. One of these concepts I actually did find a name for thanks to ChatGPT, but the rest I made up. Look, I know how that sounds, but obviously I'm not just making these up out of thin air. If you know me, then you know that I've been in the online debate circle for about 3 years now. As you will see if you argue people enough, these are actually fairly common concepts that I'm about to go into, so it's weird that they don't have names. Which is exactly why I want to introduce them to you, so hopefully more people can recognize them, call them out in arguments, and also avoid using them. I guess I'm just being transparent because I don't want you to think as though any of these are going to be phrases that people are going to be familiar with or have any academic authority behind them. However, regardless of if you just take this as food for thought or if any of these concepts actually catch on, hopefully these will intrigue you. I've ranked them in a top 5 list by least common to most common because apparently this is like 2015 Watch Mojo. Probably should have gone with like a tier list or an iceberg like Windigoon. But anyways, without further ado, number 5, the least common, but oddly enough the one that I could actually find a name for, performative contradiction. This right here is essentially why I made this list. Although it's not as common as the rest, it's just one of those things that you wish you would have known sooner, and so for the rest it's kind of sad that these things don't have like legitimate academic names. I still remember a time where I would call people out for their actions, and I got so flustered because they would just respond, "Oh, ad hominem," and I just didn't know how to explain the flaw in their argument. Because yes, a murderer can say murder is immoral, and it's ad hominem to attack the character of the speaker instead of addressing the argument itself. You know, for example, "Oh, you're a murderer. What do you know about murder being immoral? If murder is so immoral, why do you do it?" That's ad hominem. But there's a clear difference between that and cases such as a person saying that morality is subjective, claiming that murder is immoral, but then committing murder. And I think a lot of us can just intuitively understand that difference, but how do we actually explain it? Well, it's a performative contradiction. An easy example of a performative contradiction is the statement, "I'm dead." If I'm saying it, how is it true? How could I be dead? See, here we aren't attacking my character, especially not attacking it instead of the argument. We're pointing out the fact that an utterance of this statement makes the statement false. For example, in the statement, "truth cannot be known," you may be able to come up with an argument that holds up in theory as to why truth cannot be known. But when it comes time to actually act upon it, the very act of accepting it as true makes it false. If truth cannot be known, then you cannot make the claim that truth cannot be known, because that would be a claim of known truth. And here we aren't really saying that people are wrong because of their character. Nor are we even really saying that you would need an empirical observation of something failing like you would in order to say that it fails in practice. And this is just sort of an aside that we don't really have time for. If you can't tell, not a fan of the terms in theory and in practice. It's just kind of a way of coddling people. If you're in theory and in practice are not the same thing, that just means you're wrong. That's just called being wrong. And here we sort of even see that performative contradictions sort of exceed the concept of both. We are not saying a belief contradicts itself in the strictest sense, but that it conflicts with an action that must be true if the belief itself is true, and that's the contradiction. Moving on, number 4 is something ChatGPT told me could be called a self-defeating objection. But unlike the other one, I could never find sources for self-defeating objection beyond what ChatGPT told me, so also, the way I'm more specifically talking about it, I would call it a critique conclusion contradiction, and I'll explain why briefly. But first, it also said that it was an inconsistent triad, and in that, it is technically right. Like, in so much as navy blue is blue, it is an inconsistent triad, but it goes so far beyond that, having to do with one premise that is used as a criticism to motivate some conclusion, but ultimately undermines the truth of that conclusion in the process. For whatever reason, it's really big with internal critiques, because I guess the average person just simply isn't intelligent enough to balance 2 conflicting things to prove that one is right, which is soul-crushing. For example, recently you'll see someone like Jon Stewart come along and own the conservatives through an internal critique under the belief that gun control laws infringe on rights but protect kids. So he'll come along and say, "You conservatives think drag shows harm kids, but it's a right. It's freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So mic drop, conservatives, ban guns." Except, John, do you want them to keep banning drag shows? Because that's the logical conclusion of that. Otherwise, you'd be challenging the premise that makes the critique at all meaningful, or you'd be saying neither should be banned because that's what happens when you connect the two. If you say two things are like, then your argument must necessitate like outcomes. Otherwise, you've proven yourself wrong. Same if things are unlike. The worst part about using bad arguments like these is that your opposition can come along and say, well, if you want to protect kids from guns, why not protect them from drag shows? Obviously, the order of magnitude may be different there, but the point is, it's not a loyal argument. It's literal nonsense that defeats itself no matter who says it. So, on to number 3, circular exclusion. The most help I got in researching this was that it is a form of begging the question, which sort of already knew since my placeholder name was circular exclusion. So yeah, and maybe that's just on me for being too specific, because literally all I'm talking about is when someone assumes that something excludes something else, when whether or not it is excluded is essentially the point of the argument, making it circular. A short example being that most arguments on whether or not the life of an unborn child is actually valuable center around the concept of personhood. So to say it's not a person, it's a fetus, it's a clump of cells, it's a parasite, not really a valid argument, because you're just assuming that one excludes the other. And particularly in the case of a fetus, we know it's a fetus. That's what we're discussing, whether or not a fetus is a person. You can't just say it's not because it's not. So yeah, that's obviously almost exactly the same as begging the question. It is begging the question. I just feel an importance needs to be placed on the exclusion aspect because 1, it's pretty common, and 2, it's almost become an issue in its own right with how much the world seems to be losing its ability to perform basic deductive reasoning. A term not being the same as another does not inherently make them mutually exclusive. Synonyms and categories exist. Number 2, ad gravitas, or argument from importance. And before you say that's a pretentious name that you've given it, 2 things to consider. 1, when I was trying to name these things by just describing what they were and trying to condense it down as much as I could, the best I could get for this was superficially challenging the value of an argument instead of addressing the argument itself. And I tried to get ChatGPT to name this, which it recommended ad pretium, but then I realized how bad of an idea it was to challenge an AI with understanding context. Also, as far as I'm aware, there isn't even remotely a recognized concept like this one, but in the age of the internet, there needs to be. You will get these very annoying people to just put how I feel about them extremely lightly. And all they do is go, nobody says that. Yeah, but that's just an internet insert group, not a real insert group argument. Or, you can't expect people to be logical. And it's just like, okay, is the argument I presented you with wrong though? No? Then what do you think you're actually accomplishing? If the only purpose of my argument is to speak the truth, then there's no valid way of challenging that if what I'm saying is true. But nonetheless, these people will try. And it's especially frustrating because if it doesn't matter, then why does it matter that it doesn't matter? One time I had a guy explain to someone in my comments because that person didn't understand the video, and then that same guy went on to tell me how this was a basic concept that everyone knew and I should make better videos. Like, you walking tumor, you literally just had to explain my video to someone. Clearly not everyone knows it. So in cases of that person and people like him, you could say that I'm jumping to conclusions. But generally, it just seems so obvious that these people know that they're wrong. These people likely know that the argument is valid, so they just decide to try to explain away why truth doesn't matter. Which is why, again, if any of these terms are going to become a thing, please make it this one, because these people cannot be reasoned with. They just need to be exposed and shamed into submission. And yeah, ending this video on a chipper note, I guess. But finally, number 1, affirmative red herring. This one isn't as frustrating. Well, it makes me a little bummed out because I was going to call this one affirmative distraction, but apparently that's an all-black improv group, and I try to avoid name confusion the best I can, so affirmative red herring it is. This may be a thing called fallacy of ignoring a counter-argument by Douglas Walton, but I couldn't find any sources on that either. And I feel as though that name is too long and doesn't really leave much to the imagination, so I think mine is better. But if you couldn't guess, this is when you ignore a counter-argument, which is probably the most common flaw in any argument online. So it's weird that for whatever reason, it doesn't even have a name. And if you're wondering why I went with affirmative red herring, I'm not just talking about when someone ignores a counter-argument. More specifically, I'm talking about a very common thing people will do to convince themselves that they made a legitimate rebuttal, which is to simply make another affirmative claim which they believe strengthens their argument. but it doesn't, because that's not how that works. And I'm excited because I finally thought up a good explanation for this one. So imagine that you're trying to tile a floor in a set space. And also, to make this more analogous, imagine that you can't cut the tiles, because that would be akin to twisting the facts. It's simply your job to connect these ideas to form a consistent set of ideas. In other words, a consistent ideology. If I set the tiles like this, do I have a consistent ideology? No? Why? Well, of course your argument will be that there's a gap right here. But now imagine if, in responding to your criticism, I say, what gap? There's no gap over here, nor over here. Do you see how that doesn't actually address the truth that my ideology is in fact inconsistent? I simply brought up irrelevant claims, red herrings, to distract from the fact that, yes, there it is, a gap, right there. My ideology is inconsistent no matter how good the rest of it may seem, because the rest of my ideology may even be true. And to explain that in short, the rest of my ideology would be akin to a broken clock. It may be right, but it's not valid. One contradiction, one, is enough to render an entire system of belief invalid. And you cannot ignore contradictions. And no, I'm not trying to tell you to give up every time a troll online says that your ideology is logically inconsistent. But obviously, if you were going to make an affirmative claim to prove that in fact there is no contradiction in your ideology, that would be a rebuttal. You are addressing the contradiction. You may be saying, look over here, that's why there's no contradiction over there. But nonetheless, you are actually addressing the contradiction in order to disprove it. Whereas basically everyone else on the internet is just talking past each other. They'll listen to an argument made against their belief and just go, well, I believe this because, yeah, I don't care. I know you believe that. What I want is for you to actually prove to me that your belief is logically consistent. And as long as a contradiction remains unchallenged, it is not. So yeah, that's it for this video. If you guys like the more number 15 style content and found this to be more brief and palatable, let me know. But like, palpable brief philosophy is an oxymoron, so don't expect this to be a mainstay, especially since it sure as hell wasn't brief.